The desert sky burned with two suns, and the wind carried dust that cut against the skin like blades. The villagers of Karen gathered around the circle of stone, their voices filled with cruel laughter. They mocked the girl who stood alone, her skin the color of midnight blue, her foreglowing eyes lowered but unbroken. They called her cursed, an omen, a mistake born of both worlds yet belonging to none. She heard their words, but she did not bow her head. She only clenched her fists and kept her silence. The girl's name was Lyra, and she had survived storms and hunger, yet the cruelty of her people weighed heavier than both. They surrounded her with spears and shouts, daring her to break. She had 4 eyes, 2 aligned like a human's and 2 smaller ones beneath, glowing faintly with silver light. The others despised this, believing it unnatural. To them, she was less than a warrior, less than a woman, less than a voice. But even as their mocking grew sharper, she remained still. Deep in her chest, she carried a secret. That was when he appeared. A lone figure walked through the sand, his cloak torn from travel, his face shadowed by grit and scars. He had 1 eye, the other hidden by a leather band that bore the mark of battle. In his hand, he carried an old sword, its metal dull and chipped, yet alive with something unseen. The crowd turned their laughter toward him, sneering at the human who dared step into their circle. But the man did not answer them. His steps were steady, his eye fixed not on the crowd, but on Lyra. The people jeered. They shouted at him to leave, to crawl back to the caves where outcasts belonged. But the man reached Lyra's side and stood beside her, without a word. She turned her 4 eyes toward him, stunned by his defiance. No one had ever stood beside her before. He drew the blade halfway, and the light of the suns reflected along its edge. Then he spoke, his voice rough yet calm, a question that cut to the desert like thunder. "Who wants to be first?" he said, raising the blade between Lyra and the crowd. The laughter stopped. The air shifted. Even the wind seemed to pause as his words sank into the silence. For the first time, the villagers looked not at Lyra, but at him. His single eye burned with the fire of someone who had already known loss and pain. His blade trembled with old strength, yet his stance was unshaken. The people, once bold in their cruelty, now found no one willing to step forward. They had mocked her 4 eyes, but now their own gazes wavered under the challenge of one man's single eye. Lyra's breath caught in her chest. Something stirred in her heart that she could not name. She had been alone for so long, and yet here was a stranger who risked his life to shield her. She saw scars across his arms, old burns and marks of battles fought in silence. He was not of her people, not of her blood, yet he stood taller than any of them. She felt her fists loosen as his sword gleamed before her. The crowd had mocked her, but now they hesitated. For the first time, she was not alone. The silence stretched across the desert as the villagers hesitated. They had been so bold in mocking the girl, but now they stared at the stranger who stood beside her. His single eye was steady, his grip on the blade firm, and the challenge he gave hung heavy in the air. Lyra felt her 4 eyes burning, not with shame as before, but with something new. She saw in him a shield that no one had ever offered her before. The leader of the villagers, a broad figure with scales along his jaw, finally stepped forward. He carried a spear tipped with bone, and his voice carried a sneer. "You think 1 eye and 1 sword can stand against us?" he mocked. His words brought uneasy laughter from those around him, though the sound was weaker now. The man did not flinch. He adjusted his stance and raised the sword higher, the sunlight dancing across its old metal. Lyra felt the weight of the moment press against her chest. The leader thrust his spear, testing the human speed. In a blur, the blade moved, knocking the spear aside with a sharp clang. Dust rose, and the crowd gasped at the sudden show of strength. The human did not strike back, only lowered his weapon again in silent warning. His single eye fixed on the leader, as though daring him to try again. Lyra's heart raced, and the villagers shifted uneasily, their confidence cracking beneath the steady power of one man. The leader growled, stepping back with anger flashing in his reptilian eyes. He was not used to resistance, especially not from a stranger. His pride burned, and he barked orders to the crowd. "Seize them both," he roared. Yet none moved. Their earlier cruelty melted away under the sight of the human's blade. The man had not spoken another word, yet his stance spoke louder than threats. His quiet defiance spread like fire through the silence, holding back the mob that had once seemed unstoppable. Lyra looked at the villagers, their sneers now gone, their eyes shifting nervously. For years she had carried the weight of their scorn alone, and now for the first time they feared to touch her. She turned to the human, and her 4 eyes met his single one. A question burned inside her. Why would he stand for her when no one else had ever done so? She wanted to ask, but her voice was lost under the storm of emotions surging within her. The human finally spoke again, his words low and steady. "I will not let you harm her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut deeper than a shout. The villagers stepped back, glancing at one another. The leader snarled and raised a spear again, unwilling to lose face. The tension thickened, and every breath felt like it could break the balance. Lyra's heart pounded as she realized the stranger had drawn a line in the sand that no one dared cross. The desert wind howled through the rocks, scattering dust across the circle. The man's cloak whipped behind him, his blade still gleaming under the suns. The villagers had mocked her 4 eyes since the day she was born, but now those same eyes witnessed something they had never seen. One man standing alone, refusing to bend, refusing to fear. And in that moment, Lyra felt something rise within her that she had thought long dead. Hope, fierce and alive, lit inside her chest like fire. The villagers did not move, their courage fading with every second. The leader's snarl grew wider, but his steps slowed as if he too felt the weight of the human's presence. The sword in the stranger's hand was not polished or new, yet the way he held it made it seem like a weapon of kings. The villagers who once mocked Lyra now kept their distance. Their fear gave her a strange sense of strength she had never known before. The human turned his eye toward Lyra. His gaze was steady, and though he said nothing, she felt his silence speak louder than any words. He had chosen to stand beside her when no one else would. That choice burned into her heart, breaking the chains of shame she had carried for years. She did not lower her head anymore. Instead, she straightened her back, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked her. Her voice was silent, but her stance now spoke for her. The leader spat on the sand and struck the ground with his spear. "You dare defy our judgment," he hissed, his words twisting with venom. "Then you will share her fate." His threat carried into the circle, yet still no one moved forward. The human lifted his blade again, its edge catching the sunlight like fire. His single eye narrowed with determination, a silent promise that no hand would touch her while he stood there. The villagers trembled at his defiance. Lyra stepped closer to the stranger, her 4 eyes watching every shift of the crowd. She could feel their hatred, but now she could also sense their hesitation. The power they once held over her was slipping away. She whispered softly, her voice barely audible beneath the roar of the wind. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The man gave her a small nod, his jaw tight with resolve. "Because you should not stand alone," he answered, his words carved into her soul like stone. The crowd murmured, restless and uneasy. Their leader's fury grew, but his control weakened. He raised the spear once more, and this time he lunged forward with full force. The human met him head-on, the clash of blade and bone echoing across the desert. Sparks flew as steel bit into hardened spear, the sound ringing like thunder. The leader staggered back, his pride wounded more than his body. The stranger stood firm, his breath steady, his blade still ready to strike again. The villagers gasped at the display. None of them had ever seen their leader falter. Lyra felt her heart soar, her chest filling with pride she never thought she would know. The stranger had not only defended her, but had shaken the foundation of the entire village. For the first time, they saw her not as a curse, but as someone worthy of being defended. She raised her chin higher, her glowing eyes burning with a fire they could not extinguish. The leader roared in anger, his pride refusing to accept defeat. "He is nothing," he shouted, pointing at the human with a trembling claw. "One man cannot stand against us all." Yet even as he said the words, the villagers did not move. They had seen the human's strength, and they had felt the fear his courage inspired. None wished to step forward. None wished to be the first to fall. Their silence was louder than any chant of defiance. The human lowered his sword slightly, his single eye scanning the faces before him. He had given them their chance. He had stood his ground and shown them the truth of their cruelty. Now the choice was theirs. The desert wind carried his presence like a storm across the circle. Lyra stood beside him. No longer the girl mocked for her 4 eyes. In that moment, she stood as something more, someone who was finally seen. And as the silence deepened, the world itself seemed to wait for what would come next. The circle of villagers trembled with hesitation, their eyes darting between their leader and the stranger. The clash had unsettled them more than they wanted to admit. The leader gripped his spear tightly, but the shame of being struck down in front of his people weighed on him. He wanted to strike again, yet his pride already bled into sand. Lyra stood taller now, her glowing eyes unafraid, her voice steady even in silence. The power of fear had shifted from her to him. The human stance never wavered. He was not a giant, nor clad in shining armor, but his presence carried the weight of mountains. His one eye gleamed with a fire that dared anyone to move against him. He raised the blade slightly, not in arrogance, but as a warning that he would not fall easily. The desert wind curled around them, carrying grains of sand across the circle. The sound of the shifting dunes filled the silence, reminding them that the desert respected only strength. The leader sneered and spat, his pride refusing to bend. "He is only one man," he barked. His words echoed, but none of the villagers moved. Their fear kept them in place, chained stronger than loyalty. For the first time, Lyra saw their weakness clearly. They had mocked her all her life, but now they were cowered before a stranger who dared to defend her. She felt a surge of anger mixed with triumph, a fire that burned brighter with every heartbeat. The human glanced at Lyra, his face calm yet fierce. "Do you see them now?" he asked softly. His words were for her, not for crowd. She nodded, her 4 eyes fixed on the villagers who avoided her gaze. For years she had been their target, their outlet for cruelty. Now they could not meet her stare. She felt her strength grow, not from their approval but from their fear. For the first time, she knew they no longer had power over her. The leader roared, unwilling to accept this shift. He lunged forward again, his spear cutting through the air with deadly speed. The human stepped to meet him, the clash of sword and spear ringing once more. Sparks flew as metal struck bone, and the leader staggered back with a cry. The stranger did not chase him. He stood his ground, blade pointed at the sand, his body still and unshaken. The message was clear. He would not bow. He would not break. A murmur rippled through the villagers. Their leader had fallen twice, and still the stranger stood. Doubt spread like poison through their ranks. Their strength was in numbers, but numbers meant nothing if courage had already left their hearts. Some stepped back, their spears lowering. Others looked away, unwilling to face the truth before them. Lyra's chest swelled with pride, her voice finally rising above the desert winds. "You will not touch me again," she declared. Her words struck harder than stone. The leader's face twisted with rage. He could not accept defeat before his people. He turned his fury upon them, shouting curses, demanding obedience. But their fear only deepened. None moved to obey, and many stepped farther away. The stranger had broken more than the leader's pride. He had shattered the hold of fear that had bound them all. The villagers no longer looked at Lyra with hate, but with unease. She was no longer prey. She was something more. The human lowered his blade slightly, his gaze steady. He had fought without arrogance, spoken without boasting, yet his actions had shaken an entire village. He turned to Lyra, his voice calm. "The choice is yours now," he said. The weight of his words sank into her heart. For the first time, she was not powerless. She was not the cursed child mocked for her eyes. She was someone who could stand, someone who could choose. The desert had witnessed the birth of something greater. The desert sun began to sink, painting the sands in shades of red and gold. The crowd that once roared with cruel laughter now stood silent, broken by their own fear. Their leader trembled with fury, his spear shaking in his claws. He had never been challenged in this way, and the weight of his people's hesitation crushed him more than the stranger's blade ever could. His pride, once unshakable, now cracked like dry stone under the heat of suns. Lyra stood beside the human, her 4 eyes blazing with light. She had been mocked, beaten, and cast aside since childhood. Yet in this moment, she no longer felt like the cursed outcast they had named her. She felt the strength of the man at her side, and through him, she found her own voice. The villagers no longer looked down on her. They looked away, unable to meet the fire of her stare. She had become something untouchable in their eyes. The leader roared with rage, his pride refusing to let go. He swung his spear wildly, charging at the human with reckless force. The stranger moved with calm precision. His blade rose, steel meeting bone, and the impact sent the spear spinning from the leader's grip. The weapon clattered to the ground, and the leader stumbled forward, falling to his knees in the sand. The villagers gasped, their fear now mixed with disbelief. Their champion had fallen in full view of them all. The human did not strike the final blow. He stood tall, his blade held low, his one eye locked on the man kneeling before him. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a steady fire that demanded respect. The silence of restraint cut deeper than a fatal strike. The villagers saw that strength was not just in killing, but in control. The leader's shoulders sagged, his fury drained by humiliation. He had lost more than a fight. He had lost the loyalty of his people. Lyra stepped forward. Her heart pounded, yet her steps were steady. She looked at the crowd, her 4 eyes gleaming with strength they had never seen before. "You call me cursed," she said, her voice echoing in the still air. "But the curse was your own cowardice." The villagers flinched at her words. They had expected her to cower, to remain silent forever. Instead, her voice struck them like a blade, carving away their lies and exposing their weakness for all to see. The human lowered his sword, glancing at her with quiet approval. His presence had given her the strength to speak, but her words carried the weight of truth on their own. The crowd shifted, torn between fear of the stranger and shame at their own cruelty. The leader growled but could not rise, his knees pressed into the sand. The power of the village had shifted. For the first time, Lyra was no longer beneath them. She stood above, unbroken and undeniable. The villagers began to murmur, their voices uncertain. Some dropped their spears into sand. Others turned away, unwilling to face the truth any longer. The human remained silent, his blade at his side, his one eye fixed on the horizon, as though already seeing battles yet to come. Lyra understood then that his strength was not only for her. It was for anyone willing to stand, anyone willing to defy cruelty and fear. His defiance was a spark, and she felt it ignite inside her. The suns dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sand. The crowd scattered slowly, leaving their fallen leader behind. Lyra stood with the human in the fading light, her heart filled with both fear and wonder. She did not know what future awaited her, but she knew it would not be shaped by shame any longer. The human had given her a choice, and she chose to rise. The desert would no longer know her as the cursed girl. It would know her as the one who stood unbroken. The desert village grew quieter in the days that followed. The once loud voices of mockery no longer rose against Lyra. The people avoided her gaze, their shame heavy on their shoulders. Their leader, once feared, had vanished into the deep sands, his pride broken beyond repair. Yet the silence did not bring peace. Rumors spread of distant warlords, hearing of the stranger with one eye and the girl with 4. Whispers told of armies that might come to test their strength. Lyra trained with the human each morning as the suns rose. His blade cut through the air with sharp precision, and she learned how to match her steps to his rhythm. He never spoke much, but every movement he made was a lesson. She discovered that strength was not only in the strike, but in patience, in the silence before the storm. Each day, she grew steadier, her heart less bound by fear. Her 4 eyes no longer lowered in shame, but lifted with resolve. At night by the fireside, she dared to ask him questions. "What do they call you?" she asked once. He poked at the flames before answering. "Some call me a wanderer. Some call me cursed. But names mean little. What matters is what you stand for." His words sank into her heart. For years, her name had been a wound, used against her as a weapon. Now she began to see that names could be remade, just as strength could be forged anew. The villagers watched from a distance, torn between fear and curiosity. They whispered of the stranger's discipline and the girl's growing strength. Some believed it was dangerous. Others felt a spark of pride they had long forgotten. The village, once a place of cruelty, began to stir with change. The old chains of fear were loosening, though not everyone wished for them to break. Chains, like fire, spread but also threatened to consume. One night, shadows moved beyond the dunes. Raiders from the north, drawn by the stories, descended upon the village. Their war cries split the desert air, their weapons glinting under the moonlight. The villagers panicked, scattering into the dark. Spears rattled, but few dared to raise them. Fear, old and familiar, returned like a storm. But in the heart of the village, two figures stood their ground. The human lifted his blade. Beside him, Lyra gripped a staff, her four eyes blazing with defiance. The raiders charged with savage laughter. The clash was violent and sudden. Steel met steel, and the night exploded with sparks and cries. The human fought with calm fury, his blade carving arcs of light in the dark. Lyra struck with precision, her staff cracking against armored foes. She was no longer the girl mocked in the circle of stone. She was a warrior, her courage burning as brightly as the fire spreading through the village. Together, they stood unbroken against the tide. The villagers, hidden in fear, watched the battle unfold. They saw the human fight not for himself, but for them. They saw Lyra strike not as a cursed child, but as their defender. Something stirred deep in their hearts. Spears were lifted, voices rose, and for the first time in years they joined the fight. The desert rang with unity. The raiders, once sure of their victory, faltered under the sudden strength of a village reborn. The tide began to turn. When the last of the raiders fled into the dunes, silence fell again. But it was not the silence of shame. It was a silence of awe. The villagers looked upon the stranger and the girl, no longer outcasts but symbols of something greater. Lyra stood tall, her chest heaving, her four eyes filled with light. The human lowered his blade, his one eye steady. Together, they had not only defended the village but had awakened it. A new fire had been lit in the desert, one that would not be easily put out. The village no longer mocked Lyra, but change brought new dangers. The defeat of the raiders carried whispers across the desert. Far-off warlords heard the girl with four eyes and the one-eyed human who stood at her side. Some saw it as a threat. Others saw it as a challenge. The desert was not a place that allowed peace for long. The horizon now shimmered not only with heat, but with the promise of more battles to come. Lyra walked through the village streets, her head high. The children who once threw stones now stared at her in silence, unsure whether to fear or admire her. The elders spoke of omens, but their voices carried less weight than before. The villagers had seen her fight. They had seen her stand when others ran. Respect, once denied to her, now grew like green shoots in dry earth. Still, she knew respect earned through battle was fragile. It could be lost if fear returned. The human sensed it too. He sharpened his blade under the light of the moons, his single eye watching the distance as though expecting enemies to rise in the sands at any moment. When Lyra asked him if he believed more would come, he only nodded. "Strength draws strength," he said, "and pride draws pride. They will not let this stand." His voice was calm, but she felt the warning beneath it. The desert was watching, and so were those who rule beyond it. One evening, a rider appeared at the edge of the village. He wore armor made of black and bone, his helm carved with cruel symbols. His voice carried across the sands as he announced his master's will. "Karen belongs to the warlord of Ash," he declared. "Submit or be destroyed." Fear rippled through the villagers once more. Old habits returned quickly, and some whispered that surrender was the only path. Yet others looked at Lyra and the stranger, waiting for their answer. Lyra stepped forward before the crowd. Her heart pounded, but her voice did not tremble. "We will not bow," she declared. The rider sneered, his eyes narrowing at her defiance. He promised fire and death, then turned his beast and vanished into the desert night. The threat lingered like smoke in the air. The villagers turned to her, some with hope, some with fear. But none mocked her. Her words had set a course that could not be turned aside. The human placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have chosen," he said simply. She looked at him, her four eyes meeting his single one. She did not regret her choice. For too long, she had been the one they laughed at, the one they blamed. Now she was the one who stood between them and ruin. It was a burden heavy enough to crush her, yet with him beside her, it felt possible. Together, they carried something larger than themselves. The villagers began to prepare. Spears were sharpened, walls were reinforced, and fires were lit to watch the horizon. Fear still lived in their hearts, but fear was no longer the only voice. Courage stirred, carried by the memory of the battle they had survived. They looked to Lyra and the human as leaders, though neither had sought the title. The bond between them and the village was fragile, but it was real. For the first time, unity lived in Karen. Night fell heavy, the stars blazing like fire across the dark sky. Lyra stood at the edge of the village, staring at the endless sands. Somewhere beyond, the warlord of Ash was gathering his armies. She could almost hear the drums of war echoing across the dunes. The human stood beside her, his blade at his side, his presence as steady as the desert mountains. Together they faced the horizon, knowing the storm was coming, yet unwilling to step back. The battle for Karen was only beginning. The dawn broke with the sound of drums rolling across the dunes. The warlord of Ash had come. His armies marched like a storm, black banners snapping in the hot wind, their weapons glinting under the twin suns. The villagers gathered behind their walls, their fear thick in the air. Yet this time they did not scatter. They stood with weapons in their hands, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Lyra stood before them, her staff gripped tight, her four eyes blazing with light. Beside her, the human raised his blade, his single eye cold with resolve. The warlord rode a beast of bone and fire, his armor forged in the ashes of fallen foes. His voice roared across the sands, mocking the small village that dared resist him. "You are nothing," he thundered. "You will burn." Yet his words did not shake them. The memory of the raiders defeated, of Lyra's voice cutting through fear, of a human's blade flashing like fire, held them firm. The village had once been broken, but now it stood as one. Courage, fragile yet unyielding, bound them together. The armies charged, a tide of steel and fury. The ground shook as they thundered closer. The human stepped forward to meet them, his blade gleaming as he raised it high. Lyra's staff struck the earth, and her voice rang out, clear and defiant. "We do not bow," she cried. The first clash was like a storm breaking. Steel met steel, spears shattered, and the cries of war split the desert air. The battle had begun, and every breath was fire. The human fought with the precision of one who had seen many wars. His blade cut through enemy after enemy, his single eye blazing with unshakable focus. He did not falter, even when surrounded. Each strike was heavy with purpose, each movement a wall against the tide. Lyra fought beside him, her staff cracking bone, her courage lifting the hearts of those who followed. The villagers, once afraid to raise their voices, now roared with fury as they fought for their home. The warlord of Ash himself entered the fray. His blade was massive, burning with dark fire, and his strikes shook the ground. He cut down those before him with merciless strength. The human turned to face him, and their weapons clashed in a storm of sparks. One eye met the burning gaze of tyrant, and neither yielded. Around them, the battle raged, but the true fight had begun. Every strike carried the weight of survival. Every clash a choice between hope and despair. Lyra stood guard over the villagers, striking down raiders who tried to break their line. Her four eyes burned with fury and pride. She saw the fear in her people fade, replaced by a fire that spread from one heart to another. For the first time, they fought not as individuals, but as one. Their courage rose with hers, and together they held the line. She shouted above the chaos, urging them forward. The girl once mocked for her eyes now led them with unshakable strength. The duel between the human and the warlord reached its peak. The warlord's fire roared, his blade striking with terrible force. Yet, the human did not break. His single eye burned with something stronger than fire, stronger than hate. He fought not for himself, but for Lyra, for the village, for the right to stand unbroken. With one final strike, his blade cut through the warlord's guard. The tyrant staggered, his fire faltering, before crashing into the sand. Silence followed, heavy and complete. The battlefield stilled. The remaining raiders fled into dunes, There will broken with their master's fall. The villagers stood in shock, their weapons trembling in their hands. Then a cheer rose, louder than the drums, louder than the storm. They had survived. They had won. Lyra stood beside the human, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with triumph. He lowered his blade, his face calm but his presence unshakable. Together, they had changed the desert forever. The girl mocked for her 4 eyes and the one-eyed human had become more than survivors. They had become the beginning of something greater.